Falling asleep with the TV on was never something we talked about. It wasn't a habit we explained or defended. It just happened, night after night, the soft glow filling the room while the rest of the house slowly went quiet. At the time, it felt ordinary, almost invisible. I remember the sound more than the images. Voices low enough to blend into each other, music that didn't demand attention, laughter that faded before it could wake me. The television wasn't something I watched anymore. It became something that stayed with me as I drifted in and out of sleep. The room felt different at night, smaller, quieter, held together by familiar sounds. The TV lights softened the dark, just enough to make it feel less empty. I didn't think of it as comfort. I thought of it as normal. Darkness didn't feel complete as long as something was still talking. There was a sense of continuity in those moments. Even as I fell asleep, something remained awake. The world didn't shut off all at once. It dimmed slowly, carefully, like it knew I wasn't ready for full silence yet. I never questioned why it made falling asleep easier. I didn't analyze it. I didn't label it. I only knew that when the TV was on, sleep came faster, smoother, without resistance. My body trusted those sounds in a way I didn't yet understand. Outside the room, the house settled. Doors stayed closed. Conversations ended. The night stretched out quietly. Inside, the television kept a low, steady presence, marking time in a way clocks never did. I didn't feel watched over in any conscious way. I just didn't feel alone. The space felt occupied, even as I slipped into sleep. That feeling didn't need explanation to work. At that age, safety wasn't something I thought about. It wasn't something I worried about losing. It was simply there, woven into routines I never questioned. Falling asleep to the TV was one of those routines. Only later would I understand what it had really been offering me. Back then, it was just the way nights ended, gently and without effort. The television didn't demand anything from me at that hour. It didn't ask me to follow a story or pay attention to details. It simply existed in the background, steady and predictable, letting my thoughts slow down without forcing them to stop. That quiet permission mattered more than I knew. I remember how different silence felt back then. It wasn't peaceful yet. It was too big, too open. When the TV was on, silence was softened, broken into gentle pieces that felt easier to hold. The sounds filled the gaps just enough to make rest possible. There were nights when I half listened, catching fragments of dialogue or familiar theme songs drifting through sleep. I didn't care what was playing. What mattered was that something familiar was there, something constant that didn't change suddenly or surprise me. The glow from the screen painted the room in shifting shadows. Not dark enough to feel scary, not bright enough to keep me awake. It felt like a balance designed without intention, but perfectly tuned to that moment between waking and sleep. I didn't know then that my body was learning something important, that it was associating familiar voices with safety, that it was being taught how to relax without needing full quiet or full light. I just knew that my breathing slowed when the TV stayed on. Sometimes I would wake briefly in the middle of the night, confused about where I was. The television was still there, still talking softly, grounding me before fear had a chance to form. I would turn over and fall back asleep without thinking about it. Those moments passed without ceremony. No one marked them as important. They didn't feel emotional or dramatic. They felt ordinary, and because of that, they sank deeper than anything intentional ever could. I didn't understand that safety often arrives disguised as routine. That repetition can calm the nervous system in ways reassurance never will. Falling asleep to the TV was one of those quiet repetitions, working every night without explanation. Years later, when nights became quieter and screens went dark, I would notice the absence before I understood it. The silence felt heavier then, less forgiving. Something essential had changed. Back then, though none of that mattered. I simply slept, trusting that familiar sounds would carry me gently into morning, unaware that those nights were teaching me what safety felt like. As I grew older, I stopped thinking about the television as part of falling asleep. It faded into the background of memory, the same way so many routines do. I didn't miss it consciously. I didn't think about it at all. It was just something that belonged to another version of life. But the feeling stayed. Even when the habit disappeared, my body remembered what it meant to rest with something familiar nearby. I didn't have words for that memory. I only felt it when it was gone. There were nights later on when sleep felt harder to reach. The room felt too quiet, too empty, as if something had been removed without explanation. I would lie awake longer than I wanted to, waiting for a sense of ease that didn't arrive on its own. I tried to replace it without realizing what I was doing. Music played softly. A fan stayed on even in cooler weather. Anything that could recreate that sense of presence without asking for attention. I wasn't chasing sound. I was chasing familiarity. At the time, I thought it was just preference. That I simply didn't like silence. I didn't understand that silence hadn't always felt the same. It had once been softened by routine, by gentle noise that told my body it was okay to let go. I began to notice how many people shared this habit without ever talking about it. Friends mentioned falling asleep with the TV on like it was nothing. A casual detail. But the relief in their voices told a different story. There was comfort in knowing it wasn't just me. That others had also learned to rest with something quietly keeping watch. That this wasn't a flaw or a distraction, but a shared memory woven into a generation. I started to wonder when that changed. When nights became something to get through, instead of sink into. When rest became effort instead of routine. The question lingered without demanding an answer. Looking back, I see how easy it was to underestimate those nights. How something so small could carry so much weight without announcing it. We rarely recognize safety while we're inside it. It's only later, when the room feels too quiet, that we begin to understand what was really there all along. When I think about those nights now, what stands out isn't the television itself, but the way the evening unfolded. Everything slowed down naturally. There was no rush to end the day, no sharp line between awake and asleep. The TV made that transition feel gradual, almost considerate. The house had its own rhythm at night. Dishes were already done. Voices were lower. Lights were dimmed one by one. Falling asleep didn't feel like something I had to do. It felt like something that happened when everything else settled first. The television was part of that settling, not the focus, just a companion to the quiet. It marked time gently, without alarms or expectations. I didn't feel pressure to sleep. I felt permission to drift. I realize now how different that is from how nights feel for many people later in life. Bedtimes become schedules. Sleep becomes a task. Silence becomes something you're supposed to tolerate instead of ease into. Back then, none of that existed yet. I didn't associate bedtime with worry. I wasn't replaying the day or anticipating the next one. The low murmur of the TV kept my thoughts from wandering too far, holding them close until they softened and let go. Sometimes I wouldn't even remember falling asleep. There was no moment of effort, no conscious decision. One minute I was listening, the next it was morning. That kind of rest feels rare now, almost unfamiliar. At the time, I thought everyone slept that way. That this was just how nights worked. I didn't know that routines like that could disappear, or that their absence would be noticeable later. Nothing dramatic happened in those rooms. No lessons were taught. No emotions were named. And yet something important was being reinforced night after night. A sense that rest was safe, that the world didn't vanish when you closed your eyes. It's strange how something so ordinary can become so meaningful in hindsight. Back then, it was just the end of the day. Now, it feels like a memory of calm that belonged to a different pace of life. I didn't know I would look back on those nights as something precious. I only knew that sleep came easily, and that ease felt natural, not earned. As time went on, those nights blended together into a single feeling rather than separate memories. I can't tell you what was on the screen most of the time. I don't remember specific shows or episodes. What I remember is how my body responded before my mind ever had a chance to think. There was a trust in those moments. Trust that the night would pass quietly. Trust that morning would come. Trust that nothing needed my attention once I was in bed. The television didn't provide information. It provided continuity, and that continuity made rest feel natural. I didn't understand then that my nervous system was learning something valuable, that it was being taught how to stand down, how to stop scanning, how to release control without fear. Those lessons were never spoken. They were repeated until they settled. Later in life, when nights felt heavier, I noticed how much effort sleep required. Lying awake, counting minutes, negotiating with thoughts that refused to slow down. I wondered when rest had become something that needed to be earned. Only much later did I trace that difference back to those early routines. Back to a time when rest arrived gently, without rules or techniques or expectations. When falling asleep didn't feel like failure or success, it just felt inevitable. I noticed how often people apologize for falling asleep to the TV now, as if it's a bad habit or a weakness. But when they talk about it honestly, there's relief in their voices. The same relief I felt back then, without knowing why. Those nights weren't about distraction. They weren't about avoiding silence. They were about companionship in the quiet. About not being alone with your thoughts before you were ready to let them go. Looking back, I see how easily we dismiss the small comforts that shape us. How quickly we label them as unimportant because they don't look meaningful from the outside. But meaning isn't always loud. At the time, I couldn't have explained any of this. I just slept. And that sleep came wrapped in familiarity, softness, and a sense of safety that felt so natural I never thought to name it. Eventually, the habit faded without any clear ending. One night the TV stayed off, and then another. Nothing was announced. No one said this was the last time. It simply stopped being part of how nights worked, replaced by quiet that felt different than before. At first, I didn't notice the change consciously. I still slept, I still woke up. But something subtle had shifted. Falling asleep took longer. My thoughts wandered further before slowing down. Silence felt wider, less forgiving, as if it expected more from me than it used to. I tried to explain it to myself in practical terms. I was older now. Things change, habits fade. That explanation made sense, but it didn't reach the feeling underneath. The feeling that something familiar had been removed, even if I couldn't point to exactly what. I noticed how the dark felt sharper without the glow, how the room seemed larger, emptier. The night no longer eased me into rest. It waited for me to surrender to it on my own. That difference mattered more than I understood at the time. I didn't feel unsafe, but I didn't feel held either. The quiet asked me to manage my own thoughts, to calm myself without help. I learned how to do that eventually, but it took effort. Rest had become something active instead of automatic. Looking back, I realize how gentle those earlier nights had been, how they asked nothing of me, how they carried me instead of waiting for me to settle myself. That kind of care is easy to miss when it's constant. I see now how quickly we adapt to loss when it happens quietly. When something leaves without drama, we adjust without acknowledging what changed. Only later do we recognize the shape of what's missing. Those nights taught me that comfort doesn't always announce itself. It can disappear just as quietly as it arrived, leaving behind a difference you feel before you understand. I didn't know then that I would spend years trying to recreate that ease in small ways. That I would search for familiar sounds, soft light, gentle transitions into sleep. All I knew was that nights had changed, and that something once made them feel easier than they did now. As I learned to sleep without the television, I also learned how to sit with my own thoughts in ways I hadn't before. Nights became a time when the day replayed itself more clearly, when worries had space to stretch out. Silence no longer softened the edges of my thinking. It exposed them. I adapted, the way people always do. I found new routines, new ways to signal to my body that it was time to rest. But none of them carried the same quiet ease. Rest required participation now. It asked me to be involved, to manage my own descent into sleep. I noticed how many people around me made the same adjustment. Conversations about sleep became filled with effort, tips, tricks, techniques. We spoke about rest as if it were a problem to be solved, not a state we once entered naturally. That made me realize how much had changed beyond my own room. The world itself felt louder, faster, more demanding. Even at night, there was more information, more stimulation, more reasons to stay alert. Quiet no longer arrived on its own. I thought back to those early nights and how different they felt, not because they were better in every way, but because they were simpler. The day ended without negotiation. Sleep didn't feel like a personal responsibility. It felt like a shared rhythm. I began to understand why falling asleep to the TV had felt safe. It wasn't the screen. It was the sense that something familiar was staying awake so I didn't have to. That I wasn't the only one letting go. That realization reframed the habit entirely. It wasn't avoidance or dependency. It was comfort, offered quietly and accepted without question. The kind of comfort you don't defend because you don't yet know it can disappear. I noticed how often people now reach for their phones at night, filling silence with scrolling instead of sound. The difference felt important. One eased the transition. The other kept the mind active. We replaced one kind of presence with another. Looking back, those nights feel like part of a larger rhythm that no longer exists. A time when evenings slowed naturally, when rest was allowed to arrive gently. I didn't know then that I would miss that feeling. I only knew how it felt to fall asleep without effort, carried by familiar sounds into morning. As I think about it now, what feels most different is how nights used to belong to rest, instead of recovery. Back then, sleep wasn't something you needed to earn after a long day. It arrived naturally, as part of the rhythm of living, not as a response to exhaustion. The television didn't compete with my thoughts. It gently replaced them. It gave my mind something neutral to hold on to, while everything else loosened its grip. There was no urgency in it, no demand to stay engaged. Just a steady presence that made letting go feel safe. I realize now how rare that kind of presence has become. Most things ask for attention. Most sounds want something from you. The TV at night didn't. It simply stayed on, predictable and familiar, allowing the day to fade without resistance. There was also something comforting about knowing other people were awake somewhere, that the world hadn't shut down completely, that voices existed beyond my room, even if I couldn't see them. Sleep felt less like isolation and more like joining a quieter part of life. I didn't frame any of this as comfort back then. It was just routine. But routines shape us precisely because we don't question them. They work beneath awareness, teaching the body what to expect and how to respond. When that routine disappeared, nights became more individual, more solitary. Sleep became something I entered alone, without the soft transition I had once known. I adjusted, but the difference lingered. I notice it even now, in moments when the house is too quiet and my thoughts feel too present. There's a part of me that remembers a gentler way of ending the day. Not through silence, but through familiarity. Those memories don't make me sad. They make me aware. Aware that rest once felt shared, held by routine and sound instead of managed through effort. And in remembering that, I understand why those nights mattered more than I ever knew at the time. With that awareness came a softer understanding of why those nights stayed with me. They weren't about entertainment or habit. They were about transition. About having something familiar bridge the space between being awake and letting go. That bridge mattered more than I realized. I began to notice how abrupt nights can feel now. Lights off, screens dark, silence immediate. The day ends suddenly, without easing you into rest. It's no wonder so many people struggle with sleep. We've removed the gentle in-between. Back then, nothing ended sharply. The television faded slowly into sleep, voices becoming indistinct, stories dissolving before they needed conclusions. There was no pressure to stay awake or to fall asleep. Both happened naturally, without force. I see now how that shaped my sense of safety. Knowing that the world wouldn't disappear all at once made rest feel less risky. Closing my eyes didn't feel like stepping into emptiness. It felt like stepping into something held. As an adult, I've had to learn how to create that feeling again in small ways. Soft light, familiar sounds, slow routines. None of them work quite the same, but they point back to something my body remembers. I notice how often people talk about being afraid of silence at night. I don't think it's silence itself they fear. It's the suddenness of it. The lack of transition. The feeling that everything stops too quickly. Those early nights taught me that rest doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. It needs to be kind. Kind in how it arrives, kind in how it allows you to let go. I didn't know then that those routines were teaching me how to rest safely. I thought sleep was just something that happened. Only later did I realize how much care had been built into those evenings. The memory of falling asleep to the TV doesn't pull me backward. It helps me understand why I still seek softness at the end of the day, why I value slow endings and gentle transitions. And in that understanding, I find something grounding, a reminder that rest was once natural, shared, and unforced, and that remembering how it felt can still guide how I move toward sleep now. As the years passed, that memory began to take on a different meaning. It stopped being about sleep and started being about trust. Trust that the night wouldn't demand anything from me. Trust that I could let my guard down without something slipping through the quiet. I realized how much that trust had shaped my relationship with rest. When sleep came easily, it wasn't because I was tired enough. It was because I felt safe enough. That distinction stayed with me long after the habit itself disappeared. I noticed how often people confuse exhaustion with readiness for sleep. We push ourselves until we collapse, mistaking depletion for peace. Those early nights had been different. I wasn't worn down. I was eased into rest. That difference mattered. Being eased allowed my body to release without tension. It taught me that rest doesn't need to come from pushing harder. It can come from letting go sooner. I think about how rarely we create that kind of environment now. Nights are filled with stimulation until the last possible moment. We expect our minds to switch off instantly, without preparation. It's no wonder they resist. Back then, the television served as a buffer, a gentle fade instead of an abrupt stop. It made the boundary between day and night feel porous, forgiving. I didn't know it at the time, but those routines were teaching me how to trust the quiet, not fear it, not fight it, simply enter it with support still present. As an adult, I've had to relearn that lesson in fragments. Through small rituals, slower evenings, and intentional transitions. None of them replicate the original feeling exactly, but they echo it. That echo is enough to remind me what rest can feel like when it's not forced, when it's allowed to arrive gradually, without pressure. The memory of falling asleep to the TV has become less about nostalgia and more about instruction. A quiet reminder that safety often lives in the way we end things, not just how we begin them. Eventually, I began to notice how deeply that early sense of safety contrasted with how nights feel now. Even when everything is technically quiet, the mind stays alert, scanning, replaying, planning. Silence no longer signals rest, it signals responsibility. You are alone with your thoughts, and they expect answers. Back then, the television carried some of that weight for me. It held the space gently, without asking me to participate. I wasn't required to reflect or resolve anything. I was allowed to drift. That permission feels rare now, almost unfamiliar. I started to recognize how many people carry the same longing without naming it. The way they talk about sleep is something they chase. The way they describe nights is something to survive instead of settle into. We learn to rest alone, without realizing we once rested together with something steady nearby. I noticed how quickly we judge those old habits now. Falling asleep to the TV is called unhealthy, lazy, dependent. But those labels miss what it actually provided. It wasn't distraction. It was reassurance. A quiet sense that the world hadn't fully gone dark yet. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that safety doesn't always come from silence. Sometimes it comes from predictability, from knowing what sound will come next, from recognizing a familiar rhythm that doesn't change suddenly. Those nights had a rhythm that asked nothing of me. They didn't challenge me to improve or optimize. They didn't demand mindfulness or discipline. They simply allowed rest to happen. I began to see how much effort we now put into recreating what once arrived naturally. We buy devices, follow routines, track sleep, search for solutions. All of it trying to replace a feeling we didn't know we were losing. That realization softened my view of those memories. They weren't indulgent. They were foundational. They taught my body what it feels like to stand down, to trust the night, to stop holding everything together. I didn't know then that safety could be taught through routine alone, that familiarity itself could be protective. I only knew that sleep came easily, and that ease felt normal. Now, looking back, I see how rare that normal was, and how quietly it shaped the way I still search for rest, not as an achievement, but as a place to return to. As I sit with that realization, I understand that what I miss isn't the television itself. It's the feeling of being eased into rest by something steady and familiar. The sense that I didn't have to be fully in control for the night to unfold safely. Those evenings taught me that rest could be communal in a quiet way, not shared through conversation or interaction, but through presence. Something else was there, carrying part of the night so I didn't have to carry it all myself. I notice how rarely we allow that now. We expect ourselves to shut everything off and immediately feel calm. When that doesn't happen, we blame ourselves. We call it weakness or distraction instead of recognizing it as a loss of transition. Back then, transition was built in. The day softened before it ended. Sleep arrived gradually, not as a command but as a natural next step. That gentleness shaped how my body learned to rest, long before I understood what was happening. I realize now that safety often lives in predictability, in knowing what comes next, in sounds and rhythms that don't surprise you. The television at night offered that without asking anything in return. As an adult, I've had to become more intentional about creating that feeling again. Slower evenings, softer light, familiar sounds. None of them perfectly replace what once existed, but they remind me of it. Those reminders matter. They tell my body that rest doesn't have to be earned through exhaustion, that it can be invited gently, the way it once was. That night doesn't have to feel like a drop into silence. Looking back, I see how those routines protected something fragile. A sense of trust in the quiet. A belief that letting go was safe. That belief stayed with me, even after the habit disappeared. I didn't know then that I was learning how to rest. I only knew that sleep came easily, wrapped in familiarity. Now I understand what that familiarity was offering me all along. And in remembering that, I feel less urgency to force rest, and more patience to allow it. A quiet lesson from a time when nights ended softly, and safety didn't need to be explained. Over time, that memory stopped feeling personal, and started feeling generational. When people talk about childhood now, they often mention falling asleep to the TV in passing, as if it were a bad habit or a funny detail. But when they say it, their tone softens. Something unspoken sits beneath the words. I recognize that softness immediately. It's the same recognition I feel in myself, a shared understanding that those nights offered something we didn't know how to name back then. Not distraction, not laziness, something closer to being gently accompanied into rest. I think about how many of us grew up learning that safety didn't always mean silence. That quiet could arrive slowly, carried by familiar sounds instead of sudden emptiness. That lesson settled into us before we had the language to question it. As adults, we often try to recreate that feeling with intention, but intention changes the experience. We plan for rest now, we prepare for it, we manage it. Back then, it simply arrived as part of the night, without effort or strategy. That difference feels important. Something was lost when rest became something we had to work toward. When nights stopped holding us and started waiting for us to figure them out on our own. I notice how often people talk about wanting to feel safe enough to sleep, safe enough to relax, safe enough to stop thinking. That phrase would have made no sense to me as a child. Safety was assumed. It was built into the rhythm of the evening. Those routines didn't just help me sleep. They taught me what calm felt like in the body. A baseline I would spend years trying to return to without knowing why it mattered so much. I realize now that memory works this way for a reason. It keeps what the body learned, not what the mind noticed. That's why these moments come back later, carrying meaning we couldn't access at the time. The television was never the point. It was simply the vessel. The feeling it carried is what stayed. A sense of being eased, accompanied, and allowed to rest without explanation. And in recognizing that, I understand why those nights still matter. They remind me that safety once arrived quietly, without effort, and that remembering how it felt can still guide me back toward rest. Even now, as I move closer to the present, I realize how often I return to that feeling without knowing it. In moments when the day feels too sharp, when everything seems to demand a response, I look for ways to soften the edges. Not to escape, but to ease the transition into rest, the way I once did naturally. I see it in small choices, leaving a light on in the next room, letting familiar sounds fill the space instead of forcing silence, giving myself permission to slow down before the day ends, rather than expecting sleep to happen on command. Those habits don't come from nostalgia alone. They come from memory stored in the body, a memory of nights that didn't require vigilance, of evenings that ended with gentleness instead of exhaustion. That memory still knows what it needs, even when I forget. I notice how rarely we talk about safety in this way. We talk about productivity, health, discipline, but we don't talk much about how it feels to be eased into rest, how important that feeling is, especially early in life. Those nights gave me a reference point, a quiet understanding that rest could be kind, that letting go didn't have to feel like loss. That darkness didn't need to be empty to be safe. Those lessons didn't disappear when the routine did. As the world grew louder and faster, that reference point became something I searched for instinctively. In relationships, in spaces, in the way conversations end, I gravitated toward what felt familiar in that same gentle way. I understand now that this is how nostalgia really works. It isn't about going back. It's about recognizing what shaped us and carrying it forward in new forms. The past doesn't ask to be recreated. It asks to be understood. Those nights taught me that safety often arrives quietly, without explanation, that it can live inside routines we barely notice, that it doesn't announce itself while it's happening. Only later, when life becomes louder and more demanding, do we realize how precious that quiet protection was, and how much it still matters, even now. By the time I fully understood what those nights had given me, they were already far behind me. Not gone, exactly, but transformed. They lived on as a feeling I recognized before I could explain it, a quiet knowing that surfaced whenever the day felt too loud. I stopped trying to recreate those nights exactly. I realized that wasn't the point. What mattered wasn't the television or the sound itself. It was the way rest was invited instead of demanded. The way the night arrived gently, without pressure. That understanding changed how I treated myself at the end of the day. I became more patient with the need to unwind, less critical of the moments when sleep didn't come immediately. I learned to offer myself the same softness those routines once provided. I noticed how powerful that shift was. When rest is approached with kindness, the body responds differently. It doesn't resist as much. It doesn't hold on so tightly. Safety, I learned, can be recreated through intention when memory shows you what it once felt like. Those early nights also taught me something about presence. That being there matters, even if nothing is happening. That familiarity itself can be grounding. That you don't always need silence to feel at peace. I see now how that lesson extends beyond sleep. It shows up in how I end conversations, how I leave places, how I let moments conclude without rushing them. Endings matter as much as beginnings. The television at night was never about distraction. It was about transition, about moving from one state to another with care. That care stayed with me long after the habit itself faded. I didn't know then that I was learning how to feel safe while letting go. I only knew that sleep came easily, wrapped in something familiar. Now I understand what that familiarity was teaching me. And in remembering it, I carry forward a quieter way of ending the day. One that doesn't fight the night, but meets it gently, the way it once met me. As life grew fuller and more demanding, that quiet lesson continued to surface when I least expected it. On nights when my mind refused to slow down, I noticed that what helped most wasn't forcing sleep, but recreating a sense of permission. Permission to unwind gradually, without judgment. I began to see how rarely we give ourselves that permission. We close the day abruptly, shutting things off all at once, expecting our bodies to follow instantly. When they don't, we assume something is wrong. We forget that rest once arrived through rhythm, not command. Those early nights taught me that letting go works best when something familiar stays with you a little longer. When the world doesn't disappear suddenly. When there's a soft overlap between being awake and being asleep. That overlap made all the difference. I noticed how this understanding shaped my relationship with calm itself. I didn't seek complete quiet anymore. I sought gentle continuity, a sense that the day could fade instead of ending sharply. That safety lived in gradualness. Looking around now, I see how many people are missing that softness. How often rest is treated like a finish line instead of a transition. We rush toward sleep the same way we rush through everything else, wondering why it resists us. Those memories remind me that rest isn't something you conquer. It's something you're allowed to enter. Allowed by environment, by routine, by familiarity. Allowed by kindness. Most of all, I didn't know then that something as simple as falling asleep to the TV was teaching me this. I only knew how it felt to drift off without effort, without anxiety, without needing to control the moment. That feeling stayed with me, quietly shaping how I approach the end of each day. A reminder that safety doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes it's just there, steady and familiar, helping you let go when you're ready. Eventually, I realized that what I was really remembering wasn't a habit, but a feeling of being held by the night. Not physically, but emotionally. A sense that I didn't have to stay alert once the day was done. That something else could keep watch while I rested. That realization softened how I thought about childhood. I stopped seeing those years only as a time of learning and becoming, and started seeing them as a time of being carried. Carried by routines, by familiar sounds, by environments that didn't ask much of us. I noticed how rarely we allow ourselves to be carried now. We manage, plan, optimize, even when we're exhausted. We carry the day all the way into bed, wondering why sleep feels so far away. We forgot what it felt like to be eased instead of pushed. Those early nights gave me a reference point I didn't know I had. A quiet memory of what rest feels like when it's supported. When letting go doesn't feel risky. That reference stayed with me, even when I didn't know how to name it. I began to understand why nostalgia often shows up at night. Why memories surface when the world finally slows down. It's not that we want to go back. It's that our bodies remember what safety felt like before we had to hold everything ourselves. The television, in that sense, became a symbol, not of distraction, but of shared presence. Of voices continuing somewhere beyond my awareness, of the world staying gently awake while I slept. I didn't know then that something so simple could leave such a lasting imprint. I only knew how it felt to fall asleep without effort, to trust the night without question. Now, when I feel that same softness return, even briefly, I recognize it. Not as habit, but as memory. A reminder of nights when rest arrived quietly, and safety didn't need to be explained. Now, when I think about those nights, I don't feel sadness, I feel understanding. An understanding that safety once lived in small, ordinary moments we never thought to name. Moments that didn't announce their importance while they were happening. Falling asleep to the TV wasn't about noise or screens. It was about being accompanied into rest. About knowing, without thinking about it, that the world didn't disappear the moment you closed your eyes. That something familiar remained, steady and predictable, as you let go. I see now how that feeling shaped me. It taught me that rest can be gentle, that endings don't have to be abrupt, that calm can arrive through familiarity instead of silence. Those lessons stayed, even when the habit itself faded. Life moved on, as it always does. Nights changed. Routines shifted. The world grew louder and faster. But the memory of that safety never fully left. It waited quietly, surfacing whenever I needed to remember how rest is supposed to feel. That's what these stories are really about. Not the past itself, but what the past gave us before we knew to look for it. The calm we didn't realize was holding us. The safety we only recognize once life asks us to create it on our own. If this memory felt familiar to you, if it brought back a moment you hadn't thought about in years, you're not alone. Many of us are carrying the same quiet recollections, shaped by routines that once made the world feel softer. If you'd like to keep remembering together, you're welcome to subscribe and stay for the next story. There are many moments like this waiting to be told, memories from a time when calm arrived naturally, and we didn't yet know how much it mattered. We didn't know then what those nights were giving us. We only knew how safe they felt, and sometimes, remembering that feeling is enough to find our way back to it again.